What up, everyone? It's your favorite Brooklyn boy, Anthony Carano, coming to you live with Cafe Meets Coaches. This will be a podcast centered around contemporary physical education for the masses. We'll go over a range of different topics such as skill acquisition, fitness planning, and how movement plays a role in the development of mind, body, and spirit. My goal is to help bridge the gap between academia and practice, connecting friends, colleagues, and future professionals with the motivation to move and the knowledge to do so efficiently. As the title suggests, all of the shows will be recorded in person at a cafe, which means you'll hear some background noise in the podcast. Hopefully, you too will feel as though you're there with us. Without further ado, let's get into the episode. Hi, so I have with me Liz Durden-Myers. Am I pronouncing it right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, awesome. Before we get started, the first thing I like to start with before an introduction is one of these fun cards. So we get to pick one out. It's kind of like an icebreaker card. You can pick any one you want.
Okay.
If you don't like it, you can put it back, pick a new one.
Oh, here we go.
It's a fun one.
Oh, what is the most intelligent animal? Wow, that's quite a tough question. That makes me think of, have you seen the Albert Einstein, if you judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, he'll always think that it's not very clever or intelligent. So I guess my response would be, they're all really intelligent, but at doing the thing that they're designed to do.
I love it. There you go, simple enough.
There you go, good question.
Cool. So, tell me a little bit about yourself, your experience, your background, and what brought you to where you are today.
So I had a bit of an interesting introduction into PE. So I wasn't a PE teacher straight from the off. I joined the military initially. So,
wow.
Grew up. I had two loves really, sport and physical activity, and I have quite an inquiring mind. So how things work, and I wanted to see the world. So I joined the military for a bit, and then I quickly realised I had a bit more of a passion for sport and physical activity than I realised. So came out of the military and trained to be a PE teacher, and fell in love with teaching. So I trained for 11-year-olds to 16-year-olds, and then went and did my first teaching job, and ended up looking after primary schools as well as secondary schools. So that would be all the way through, so from 4 years old all the way through to 18. Really enjoyed that, and like I said before, that's where I met Margaret Whitehead, in my undergrad. So once I got the job, she kind of took me under her wing still. I did a couple of masters, one in psychology and one in education, and then Margaret asked me, how about a PhD? So I took on the opportunity to study a PhD with Margaret Whitehead in physical literacy.
That's as cool as it gets.
Yeah, exactly. No better invitation. So yeah. I went and started studying for a PhD with her and moved into university life. So I then taught on an undergraduate programme, and now I currently run a teacher ed programme. So in two universities, so that's a really exciting job where I get to work with the new entrants wanting to join the profession.
Okay.
And so that's where I'm at the moment. So yeah, I completed my PhD in 2020, which is all about trying to operationalise physical literacy and provide physical literacy professional development for teachers.
Yeah.
And now I'm just really trying to capitalise a lot of that work and trying to really implement that in teacher ed, and also working with existing teachers but also new teachers into PE, utilising physical literacy as a framework to try and help more children be active for life.
That's great. That's as good as it gets. So some people who are listening will know physical literacy right off the bat. I know some of my college students will be tuning in, and some others, and who may have more or less experience with physical literacy or kind of know fully what it means. So maybe if you could give like a little definition or a little definition of it.
Yeah, so physical literacy, defined by the International Physical Literacy Association, is the motivation, confidence, physical competence and knowledge and understanding to be active for life. But lots of people around the world are operationalising it or taking physical literacy as a useful concept, and so there are varying definitions, but I pretty much stick to kind of a Whiteheadian perspective, so looking at trying to develop motivation, confidence, competence and knowledge and understanding, with the hope that armed with those resources and tools and capabilities, children and adults will be active for life.
And Margaret Whitehead is the founder of the term physical literacy, right?
Yeah. So the term itself can be related back into the late 1800s and early 1900s. That's when it was first mentioned, and that was actually used in a military context where an officer was relating to the physicality of of their soldiers, saying how physically literate they were. But then there was this real almost 100 years of not much use of the term. And then in around 1990, Margaret was studying for her PhD, and she rediscovered the term and felt that. Margaret is the contemporary founder of the term.
Yeah.
So you will, if you do a literature search on it, you will find one or two mentions in the 1900s. But what we mean by physical literacy today is definitely founded on Margaret's work.
Right.
She kind of started it in 1990, and then it grew in popularity until there was a really big seminal book in 2010, Physical Literacy Across the Life course. And then it's really taken off from 2020.
I have in my bag.
Is it?
Oh no, wait. Which one do I have here? No, I'm sorry, not that one. I have.
Oh, that's the second one.
Across the world.
That's
the one you're
2017. Yeah, that's the second.
Yeah.
The second book in 2017.
Yeah.
So there's a massive difference between the 2010 book and the 2017 book. So just in 7 years, the concept's gone crazy across the world.
Right. So. IPLA, that would be more of a grassroots organization when it comes to physical literacy, would you say? Or what would, so that's the organization you're part of, and Margaret Whitehead started, am I correct?
Yeah, so in 2014, Margaret, just before 2014, she went to Brazil to speak on physical literacy. And whilst there, at that conference, she kind of said there's a need for a global organisation to galvanise this interest, because there was lots of interest across the world, but no one organisation really communicating what developments were happening across the world, and that kind of overarching organisation that could pull that information together. So in 2014, she founded the IPLA, the International Physical Literacy Association.
Is that the first physical literacy association?
The first physical literacy association, So we work with lots of organisations around the world that are trying to use physical literacy as a tool, not just within education, but across health and leisure. And so that's a really fantastic organisation to be part of, because you get to see the developments in a range of countries and how different cultures are taking physical literacy and adapting it in their context. So it is a really interesting organisation to be part of, and she's still our founding president and still really actively involved in the developments of physical literacy.
Yeah, I'm a member.
Oh, brilliant.
And I definitely follow and want to continue to follow more, but there's tons of great resources on the website, and the conference that we're at now is also a physical literacy association. What are the differences, I guess, between IPLA and some of these other organizations popping up? Yeah,
so this specific conference in the IPLC, the International Physical Literacy Conference, is a conference that Canada Sport for Life originated, and we have been involved with Canada Sport for Life in the development of physical literacy since they really got hold of the term around 2014. So we've been on that journey with them, and we've had representation at every single conference that they've held across the world. So there was one in Toronto, there's been others, but it's really nice to be back in what is a great city, and obviously with the challenges that the pandemic has faced as well. So I feel like we're in a really momentous moment right now, because the world has changed since the pandemic, and physical activity has had a hit as well, and the world is different, but physical literacy still could be that unifying term to try and kickstart a more active culture in a lot of across countries, but also here in the US.
And would you say that some organizations are interpreting physical literacy differently?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so it's a nature of thing, isn't it? Like, I think if you go with luckily I've had a lot of time to study with Margaret, and obviously one of the underpinning philosophical pillars of physical literacy is existentialism, which is you see the world as you are, not as as it is. So everyone is interpreting physical literacy from the context of their own experiences. So there's always going to be that variability,
Right.
But there is, and we want that to happen as well. We want it to make sense in your context.
Okay.
However, there are some things that we need to be true to in terms of it then still being physical literacy and not deviating away from it too far. So that we would say that Margaret initially was quite wedded to the definition, but in recent years we've not necessarily been as wedded to the definition, more wedded to the principles. So as long as the principles are there, then it is physical literacy. If you're calling it something slightly different, that's fine, as long as we're talking from the same underpinning philosophical principles.
And if I'm not mistaken, let me see, monism,
Yep.
existentialism, and the third,
Phenomenology.
there you go,
Yeah.
phenomenology.
Yeah.
Are you able to give like a quick little synapse of those three?
Yeah, definitely. So monism is this idea that the mind and body are connected, and we often, it's kind of combating this Western society view that mind is better than body, or cognition over physicality, and trying to kind of reconnect those roots that we are one and the same, and it's a intricate, interconnected system. So we can't neglect our mind and body. They are inseparable. They're a whole. So that's the monist kind of view on things. And then the existentialist view is that we are a product of our previous experiences. So if we've had a negative experience in physical activity where, it's in human nature to want to avoid it, then not to replicate those similar uncomfortable experiences. But if we've had really positive experiences, then we're more likely to seek out more of those experiences. And then finally, as a result of those experiences, we're all unique because we all have a range of different and varying experiences, and that's the phenomenological lens, where no one person is the same. So what might get me engaged in physical activity could be something totally different to somebody else, and so having that personalised approach is really, really important.
Yeah, I love the philosophical, I'm always a big picture thinker, and that hooked me right away, because really, another big thing with physical literacy, motivation, confidence, like touching on those social emotional pieces, philosophical pieces, like why do we do what we do? Not just like the content itself, but like what drives and what motivates people to do certain things. And I think even just an understanding of something like monism, that your mind and body are connected. Like once you move, things are going to happen in your brain. And like once you, I've been reading a lot of neuroscience books recently, and there are deep connections between what you're feeling, what you're thinking, and what your body is doing, and vice versa. It's like top down and bottom up. They're always communicating with each other. So just, I think, understanding that connection is a big motivational factor for people, and then just touching on some of that philosophical stuff, I think, is a big part, and why I wanted to bring you on first too, because it's kind of that big picture of why people move and how can we get them to move, and kind of understand a little bit more about the connection between human flourishing, which I think we'll get to, and movement.
Yeah.
So
I think the cognitive science and the neuroscience that you mentioned is going. It's really exciting because it is communicating that it's a highway, it's a two-way street. It's not just mind telling body to move, but actually there's signals coming from the body back to the mind, and it is inextricably linked. So I think the neuroscience is a really exciting area because it is catching up, and it's kind of articulating through science what we know philosophically through embodiment.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's exciting that the science is catching up.
Yeah, and it's even cool, as a physical person, to see that there's sometimes physical evidence of things, even though we just couldn't see it for so many years. Like when you zoom into the brain, you could see there are physical chemicals that are there, that happen, and these physical connections, you're literally wired from your body to your brain. Like when you start to even break that down and see it with new technology that we have and things like that, it's pretty cool to see where we're going with things.
I often use the gloggy tendon reflex to articulate that, because I ask my trainee teachers and teachers, how do we move? And often they'll say that, well, the brain tells us to move. And then when you use the gloggy tendon reflex example where you tap the knee, actually that's a spinal column reflex. So that kind of dispels that whole view that your brain is this supercomputer telling your body to move, but actually it's a lot more complicated than that, and it's not as hierarchical as brain telling body to move, but actually it's that dynamic interplay between body and brain and as a whole system.
Yeah, and even when you, I think, dissect the brain a bit more, even the brain itself, the prefrontal cortex is connected to all these other areas of the brain that are related to movement. So even not just being wired to literally the body, the areas of movement in the brain, they're literally wired together.
Yeah. We see that in AI as well, that a lot of the supercomputers, they can do chess and mathematical problems, but actually movement and proprioception of viewing a ball, calculating the speed, travel, direction, spin, and then having a physical reaction in real time is actually way more complicated than a chess game,
right?
In terms of programming that. So I think that goes to say how intricate and complex the movement systems are.
Yeah. So I kind of put human flourishing towards the end, but I feel like it fits in pretty well now.
Yeah.
So like the connection between physical literacy, movement, and just a well-balanced life, or I know people can define human flourishing differently, I'm sure, but maybe you could touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, so me and Margaret starting to look at why is physical literacy important, and it kind of alludes back to that original question that was mixed in our introduction around what it is to be human. So I think in order to understand what it is to be a flourishing human, you almost have to ask that first question around what it is to be a human. And there's lots of research and literature and philosophy that you can draw upon, but from a physical literacy point of view, and what's kind of inspired Margaret and therefore me as well are things around the capabilities approach, so what it is to be human in that regard, and then also the human flourishing element around living optimally. So we would believe that embodiment, which is our connectedness with ourselves and our environment, so how connected you feel in place and space and with yourself, is really, really important, and that embodied sense of self is really, really powerful. And we know that through physical activity you can develop that embodied sense of self, so because you're more attuned to the environment, so whether a ball is coming towards you, or whether you're walking up a mountain, or if you're sailing, or whatever it might be, you're in that moment of relating to the environment and in relation to yourself. So we would argue that movement is inextricably linked to being what it is to be a human. And I think what is interesting is that obviously we've had this massive technological advancement over the last 100 years, and we've probably more so now been more sedentary than we ever have been in our entire existence.
Right.
And what does that bring with it? So with some of the issues we're seeing around society is that could be linked to the sedentary nature of our lifestyles. So we think that it is about movement, and to be a flourishing human, movement has to exist within your life.
I always have this interesting thought, it's a little far-fetched, but the typical view of aliens, how they have like a big head and a very small body, is just like our future selves coming to visit us. It's like, will we evolve in that direction? Or, hopefully we'll have enough advocacy from physical literacy groups to kind of change that a little bit. But yeah, there's, I like what you say about, what it means to be human. And there's no doubt that we've evolved with our bodies, and it doesn't change that fast. You can't just overnight switch things, and who knows, in trillions of years to come what will look like, but as of right now, we've evolved, I think, to be a certain way, and we evolved in certain environments, and you can't just drift from it that fast. And the embodied state, I think, is a big part of what it means to be human, and a big part of what it means to feel good as a human.
Yeah. So if you think about because we've had that those positive experiences through physical activity, I think if you look back on some of your past experiences in life and you think about some of the happiest moments, I'm sure that movement will play a part in many of those movements, and they certainly do for me.
Yeah.
And it's easy for us to think like that because we've had those positive experiences. I guess our role as advocates for physical activity and physical literacy is to try and ensure and understand the other side of the coin with children and adults who haven't had those positive experiences, and how can we rebuild that and reconnect them with physical activity in a positive way, so that when they do look back on their experiences, they think positively about the enriching experience that has played rather than the negative emotions it might evoke. So yeah, I think that it's really important, the role of positive experiences.
So that kind of ties a little bit into one of the other topics, like community design. When it comes to whether it's physical education in schools, or how we work, or how we design our communities, or how we design our home spaces, or just like, I know that's a very big question, you know, you don't have to answer all of them, but if there's one that stands out, is there, you know, a way that you think if you were able to design tomorrow a society, like what would it look like to help promote physical literacy?
Yeah, it's a really tough question, isn't it?
I know, like, that's a big one.
But I think it all comes back down to prioritization. If you value something, normally you'll make time for it. And in today's society, we live fast, don't we? We're always busy. There's always something to do, somewhere to go, a to-do list. But if physical activity or something on that to-do list daily, or even weekly or monthly, but we need to prioritize physical activity. And I know that that's the way that I get around it, because, you know, I live a fast-paced life also, with a young family, and it'd be really easy to pop that to the bottom of the list and therefore maybe get it knocked off the list. But if I prioritize it within my day and make space for it, it will happen. So I think that we need, as a family, if you're in a family situation, or as an individual, or as a culture, you need to prioritize and design in that physical activity time. And it's not just about getting your step count, it's not just about you know, saying you've been to the gym. It's about being in the moment while you're doing it, because it's not just about body as machine, like we've mentioned around monism. It's not just about getting your steps. It's about having a meaningful experience, so that you feel rejuvenated through that physical activity and ready to tackle the rest of the day or the other things that you need to do. So I think it's all about designing in physical activity, and part of that is prioritizing it, whether that's in landscape, in the architecture, or the how big your backyard is, or, you know, in terms of housing design, or if it's in where you put your parking lot and you've got to walk to the office block, or you know, making it part of daily life, but also having those moments where you're in the moment and you're here, enjoying being physically active and being present. Because I think there's nothing better than the thought maybe of going to the gym might be one that you don't necessarily want to do, or go for a run, but once you're there and in the moment, you know, you feel alive and you feel good, and then that experience then stays with you for the rest of the day or the next day, and so on. So yeah, designing it in and prioritizing it.
Yeah, so it also makes me think of, because you mentioned going to the gym, and an interesting question I had was around you know, fitness culture.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's similar in England, but you know, right here in New York City, being fit is going to the gym. It's, you know, lifting weights and running on a treadmill. And sometimes when I see that, which is still good if that's what someone wants, right? I think if that's what someone's motivated to do. But I think there's a lot of people that are not motivated to do that are forcing themselves sometimes to do it.
Yeah.
And I almost feel like we can benefit from the holistic nature of activities. So like, as opposed to, you know, I've done martial arts my whole life, and cardio kickboxing is popular. And, you know, you're hitting the bag, and so maybe as opposed to cardio kickboxing, actually indulging in the sport of kickboxing. Not saying you have to go and compete in the ring, but meaning learning the technique, maybe learning the philosophy, learning the history. You know, a lot of fitness classes don't emphasize technique as much. It's more, you know, getting the steps, getting the calories. And I almost feel like we could benefit from activity selection as opposed to a gym culture.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious your thoughts.
Yeah, same. I think Margaret had it perfect in the book around where she mentioned around a range of movement forms, and how these different movement forms call forth a different relationship with physical activity. And you're right in terms of the fitness culture, but also in the UK, and I'm sure it might be similar here in terms of the dominance of competitive sports.
Right.
And that may not be the menu that all people would want to choose from.
Right.
So having a rich menu where, whether you're, I like using the menu analogy, because if you go in, one person might want to choose, because we're in New York steak. Other people might want to have a salad. It's absolutely fine. It's about what you want to choose, and because it has meaning to you, or it's because it's culturally relevant to you. So I think it's really important that we often, as well as PE teachers, put on a menu that we liked, or a diet that we had ourselves, rather than understanding the children in front of us and what would be the most enticing menu for them.
Right.
So yeah, I definitely think that a variety of movement forms is really powerful, because you're more likely to appeal to more people, but also different movement forms call forth a different relationship. So being on the water, canoeing or sailing or swimming, open water swimming, is completely different to, so let's use the open water swimming analogy. Open water swimming is completely different to swimming in a pool.
Right.
Not to say that one's more meaningful than the other, but it's just a different relationship. Similarly, competitive sports is something that I enjoyed, but when I think about my peers, that my peers don't necessarily enjoy that. Or even now, in where I am in my life, I'm probably more towards, I still play netball, competitive sport, but those kind of lifestyle activities in terms of walking and going to the gym and those sorts of things. So if we're not exposed to them in our phys ed curriculum, then potentially we won't know that that's something that we'd like to partake in.
And that makes me think also, in a phys ed curriculum, I often get a bit torn between how do you give someone enough competence but enough variety.
Yeah.
So, like when I think elementary school, I think the fundamentals. I think middle school, I think variety. When I think high school, I think narrowing in a little more on a couple of things. But like, let's take middle school, for example. Even when I'm thinking variety for middle school, I sometimes wonder at what point is it too fast to move on, or how much, that balancing act of giving variety but allowing kids to get some success. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. We use the analogy you don't want to be an inch deep and a mile wide, because you're not actually getting any roots in anything. And we also say it's not a phys ed curriculum, it's not about providing a carousel of activities where you just go through the motions. And there's been research to say you can also get that fad factor, where there's that, this is a new sport, yeah, great, or new activity, but then they lose interest, but then they want the next one. So yeah, developing actual competence is a real fine balancing act, because you can also get the converse as well, can't you, around, what we've done this for 4 years, why are we still doing it? So I think that it goes back to the roots of phys ed, which is learning. You shouldn't necessarily move on unless they've grasped what the learning intentions were for that unit. So it needs to be really carefully sequenced, so that we're not moving children on without having that firm foundation. But also then those, which is really challenging, because there's obviously then class of 30 children all at different points, and that's really difficult to teach. So it's understanding what
New York City sometimes 50 to 100.
Do you? No way.
Sometimes. Yeah.
That's really challenging. Yeah, we probably wouldn't go over 35 children, but 100 children. That's really, really tough to try and have that personalised journey. So it is really, really difficult. But I think it goes back down to that the pedagogy element, isn't it? It's not just about what we're doing. It's not what we're doing today. It's what we're learning, and where are you in your learner journey. So getting away from that just exposure isn't good enough. It has to be learning and progression and mastering those basic competencies.
Do you know about how long you might stay on a unit, for example?
Yeah, so we are in a unit. We normally, the tradition in the UK is that we would be on a unit for around 6 weeks.
Okay.
But there's been calls to extend that. So we're saying now that 6 to 12 weeks. But what we would do is, instead of teaching football, for example, the ideal would be that you'd have an invasion game block. So you can still have lots of the principles running through, but you get exposure to a couple of different sports. So if it's about creating space and attack, you'd explore that concept through a range of sports, not just through one sport.
Right. So within that 6 or 10 week period, you'll go through a couple of different invasion games, or maybe activities from different types of invasion games, and you're emphasizing the skill or the concept,
Yeah.
obviously, over the game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think if you want to specialise, that's when you go to your extracurricular or your clubs and your sports after school or out of curriculum time. But what we're trying to do in the curriculum time is teach much more through concepts. And so you're getting exposed, and the notion of transfer. So what if we're teaching creating space and attack, like I just mentioned, you don't teach that 3 times throughout the year with just a different sport. You can then move, you can create the space then to move on to a different activity, which might be aesthetics, where we're looking at gymnastics and dance and different principles and concepts. So it's because it's tight, you know, what do you put in a curriculum framework, and there's you have to look at which are the things that are going to give you the biggest bang for your buck, or what are the biggest value. And I think we do a lot of reteaching, and also understanding. We do this a lot as well, and when we get around to the summer and we go into summer sports, say for example when you look at, you know, softball, or we play like rounders or cricket, often you go straight into that throwing and catching, but they've probably had quite a lot of that throwing and catching throughout the rest of the year.
Right.
Whereas actually the hardest skill in those kind of sports is the striking element, but we normally put them towards the end of the unit, whereas maybe we should be prioritising those more complex with some adaptations.
So in another question though, in that 6 to 10 week period, about how many days a week do you see the kids?
So we get it varies, because now the government would advocate that you get 2 hours of high quality PE a week. But that's it's not statutory, so that's the guidance. But schools can offer more or they can offer less, and often with changing time and transportation from the changing rooms out to the area, and then we've got this problem around teacher talk time as well. Lots of teachers wanting to explain things, which then eat into activity time. So it's, even though we'd say we want 2 hours a week, we don't necessarily get that.
Gotcha. I was just curious because some people may have more or less within that 6 to 10 week period. So just to kind of get an idea of how many classes you might be getting, or how many hours, or how much contact time. So in regard to phys ed curriculum, like some of the fundamentals, or what are like some of the fundamentals? So do you have a scope and sequence, and are there some fundamental activities like throwing, catching, or skills, sorry, I meant to say, but throwing, catching, that you would recommend that all kids learn? And even if you were an adult starting off and never had a quality phys ed experience, I think you'd be almost like an elementary school kid. Like, these could be some things even for you to think about.
So in terms of the UK, we do have a national curriculum that sets out like 6 activity areas, but I think that, and 4 overarching aims in the national curriculum, but it's quite, I would say, quite traditional and outdated in a way. But so from a physical literacy lens, I definitely would draw upon what we know about the fundamental movement skills around object control, locomotion, and balance and stability. So we know that those 3 things are really important, and we also now know as well, like the kind of the strength element and the cardiovascular fitness element as well. So I guess we like I think in terms of physical literacy, we're not trying to necessarily create the next Olympian. We're trying to have everyone with that moderate competence to be able to, I like to call it like pick up and go. So if a ball rolls towards you in a park, you can pick it up and throw it back. Or if someone invites you to a softball game, you can go and have a impromptu softball game, or you can go and have go for a run and be able to self-regulate and all sorts. So I think that those sorts of things are really important. So understanding object control, so manipulation skills. Can you control it like a hockey stick, or throwing and catching? Can you send? Can you receive? Those sorts of skills. And then balance and stability, we know that everything has to come from the pivot, so that having the strength for balance and stability is really important as we age as well. That's probably one of the most important factors around having mobility in your older age. So, and then we also know the locomotion movement, so making sure good range of movement, flexibility, working at different speeds, starting, stopping, rolling, falling, those sorts of elements. And then I would also then say the only problem with that is if you take it quite literally like that, it drives pedagogy in that way. So I would then flip it and say these are all the ingredients that we know that we want. How can I do that in a really rich context? So I like to use the baking the cake analogy there. It's not about just taking the ingredient and working on the ingredient. It's about how can I mix them all together in creating a cake, and that cake is that movement experience. So could it be in a conditioned game where I know that I'm working on lots of different things at once, so I'm getting a lot of bang for my buck, or I'm working on 4 or 5 things rather than lining children up and doing a standing stalk balance because I'm working on stability.
Right.
There's ways in which you can hack the system to get lots of things in, and make it fun, enjoyable, and meaningful as well, rather than making it quite linear. So we don't want that kind of linear approach.
Wow, I just got a brain fart. There was a question I was going to... the activities. So because you made me think of something when I think of physical education or that like general approach, because like you said, there's clubs, there's teams, there's all these other things if you want to get more specific, but kind of like generally speaking, I would like my kids or anybody I'm working with, even if I was a personal trainer or in that realm, but to be able to engage with movement in every and any opportunity they can.
Yeah.
If they were at a wedding and dance music came on, I want to know that they could dance.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be an amazing dancer, but enough to enjoy it. If your friends are playing volleyball at the beach, you can get up and bump the volleyball enough to engage with it or have some fun. And, and you can't be a master of everything, but, I kind of classify these activity areas like, I think about rhythm and dance. I think about sport and games, which could obviously be broken out. But do you have some activity categories that you would kind of fit everything into?
Yeah, definitely. In the 2010 book, Margaret talks about adventure activities. So these are things that are done in a natural environment. And then you've got aesthetic activities, which is the dance element that you mentioned, or rhythmic gymnastics and those elements. We've got health.
Does bodybuilding fit in there too, or not really?
Not really. So bodybuilding would go into health and fitness. That's
Okay.
the kind of health and fitness or athletic. She also mentioned athletic. So the athletic one is more higher, faster, stronger. So I guess it depends on how you approach the bodybuilding. If you're trying to do it through powerlifting, that would probably be higher, faster, stronger, athletic. If you're doing it health and fitness, or if it's bikini modelling or anything like that, or Arnold Schwarzenegger, Misty Universe, it might be health and fitness related. But again, that's a fine art, isn't it? Because actually those guys that are in such good shape, you could argue, are they in optimal health, or actually are they putting their body through a bit too much?
Yeah, without a doubt.
So there's health and fitness, athletic. There's competitive that we mentioned before, which we know tends to dominate, but should only be about a fifth of it. There's relational, so mentioned about dancing at a wedding, or it could be country dancing or anything, Chinese New Year, whatever it might be. So something physical activity that's related to culture. And how much is that? 5? And then Margaret also talks about aquatic activities, so that could also be another one as well. I think I've got there. So that's health and fitness, adventure, athletic, competitive, relational, and then might be aquatic as well in there.
That's interesting, like relational. So as opposed to, rhythm and dance, you said actually could fit under there, or probably aesthetic. Yeah,
it depends on how you're approaching it. So for example, like when you look at some of the, say we go to Australia and the Maori traditions, some of those ceremonial dances are more around the relational element and the cultural significance of it, rather than dance per se as an embodied bit. Or it could be both.
I like the way that you're categorizing it based on the relational piece. Like you said. So, because our scope and sequence, we kind of divide it, like I said, the sports and games, rhythm and dance, but you could take a sport and game and engage with it competitively, or maybe with friends and cooperatively. So that's interesting how you're kind of dividing it more based on, I guess, what's motivating you to move as opposed to the activity itself.
Yeah, exactly. So here in New York, basketball is a really relational activity, I would imagine, because it's part of your culture. And same with the baseball, and same with ice hockey. Whereas, if you went and took baseball and landed it where I am, it probably wouldn't have the same success because it's not as culturally embedded within my culture. So it might be more the rugby or the netball where I'm from.
Do you play I don't know the new name for it, but Quidditch has
Oh
like
yeah.
Is it popular?
Yeah, so we introduced it into some schools are using Quidditch as a way to engage students. Yeah.
I did a workshop with Quidditch in there, so it's just it kind of touches a little bit on what you said earlier about the fad, almost like fad dieting in the sense of like, but there's some benefits to engaging with, I guess, some things that might excite people.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was just curious if Quidditch was popular, or I know they renamed it. I don't know if you know the name, but they gave it a new name, and it's like an official sport.
Yeah, no, we've got lots of emerging new sports. There's a great sport called kinball. Have you heard kinball? Yeah, so that's...
Heard of it, but I've never really engaged with it.
Yeah, no, it's great. I think what these new sports and activities do is they level the playing field again. So culturally, those that probably, it's human nature, people then start saying, oh, I don't play X, I do Y. Whereas if you introduce a new sport, you're like, well, actually, it's fair game, and no one's. With then everybody gets that new chance to play and explore a new sport and activity. So I think sometimes not having these formal activities is a good thing, because there's too much high stakes. If you're known for competing in basketball outside of school, and then there's a basketball inside, and it can be quite threatening in a way, because it's part of your identity. But if there's a new sport and activity and just exploring movement and having a good time, it's a different relationship again. It's like similar to me in that I got to quite a decent level of golf, and for a long while I couldn't play golf because I was frustrated that I wasn't at the level that I used to be, even to the point I couldn't play crazy golf without enjoying it. But until I got over that, and I was like, actually, re-establishing that relationship, you don't have to be the best at it. You can have some poor shots. You don't have to be, off a scratch or, 6 handicap or whatever it is. You can just enjoy the game again. So it's not just about doing it, but it's the relationship and the environment through which. So we'd call them like learning vehicles. So it's a vehicle, isn't it? What you and where you're taking them in that 50 minutes. So what's the point of that Quidditch? Is it to what's the point of it? Is it to expose them to a new sport or activity? Is it to develop movement? And if it's not Quidditch, it could be something completely different.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And New York City, you'll see a lot of teaching to the game sometimes, but more so. It doesn't matter what the game is. Like you said, what's the point? What skill, what concept are we teaching here? You could literally use anything. It doesn't really matter. Just know the skill and the concept and teach that and make sure it's explicit.
Yeah. I think that's a great point, because I think we get hung up on teaching the sport rather than teaching the children. And like you say, to a certain extent, the context or the sport or activity is irrelevant. It's like, what do you want them to learn? And what's the best way? And what's the best sport or activity to achieve that aim? And that could be mix and matching. It could be not playing a defined sport, but actually creating a new sport or a new activity to achieve that aim.
And when it almost makes me think, so those 5 categories you said before: relational, competitive, what were they?
Athletic, health and fitness,
and there was one more. Aquatic, right?
Yeah.
That I could almost teach units based on those. Yeah. Like a competitive unit, a health and fitness unit.
Yeah.
Do you do that, or?
Well, we've got some of our schools are still quite traditional, and they're still in those linear kind of sports. But that's what we would advocate. That's how we'd like you to move into. So yeah, a lot of the professional development we do is I get them to I call it like balancing the colours and shades. So I get them to identify all the things that they deliver, and then I put them into those categories, and then we put them in a different colour. So aquatic might be blue, and then you look at your timetable or your curriculum design, and if it's really dominated by one colour, you haven't got a broad and balanced or rich and varied curriculum. So I'd say it's all about trying to balance the colours and shades. So okay, we've got loads of competitive in there, but if that's, because I'm also a realist, that might be, there's no way you're getting around it. That is what's going to happen. Because of the other things that are going on, but at least how could you then balance the shades within that? So if it is still really dominant competitive curriculum, how can you not just have basketball for 5 years, but how could you introduce new activities?
We're not allowed to do recording unless it goes through our marketing.
I could shut that off. Yeah, no problem. Thanks. Yeah. I could shut that off. Yeah. Sorry about
That's
that.
all right, no worries.
What was the last thing you were just saying there?
No.
Oh, the different shades.
Yeah, different shades. So because I'm like I said, I'm a realist. So it might be that you can't get away from it, but you can still work within that system. So you can have basketball and softball and all these other sports, rather than just not having one or two sports really dominate.
Right.
So but I would advocate for teaching across those 5 areas /6. So that way you know that you're providing the richest menu you can.
Right. Yeah. When it comes to health and fitness, lifting weights, do you think that everybody should learn how to do resistance training? Is that something everybody should embed in their life, resistance training? What do you think?
So we've got some guidance from the Association for Physical Education in the UK, which kind of sets out quite clearly that children under a certain age shouldn't be lifting weights. It should all be body weight exercises because of the effect on the growing body and youth and maturation. So I think that's a really interesting area, and you have to think about when you introduce that. But if you look at trends, a lot of adult engagement in physical activity is in the gym, and if it is a dominant physical activity, yes, we certainly should be incorporating that within education. But I think we need to be really careful that we don't just do CrossFit for kids, because that's not appropriate, or resistance training for kids. It has to be pedagogically sound. So you can teach health and fitness and resistance training, but it's more about movement, form over and function, isn't it? So range of movement. You can do a lot of those exercises with body weight. You don't need to put a bar on and weights. You can, a lot of that exercise you can do through using your body weight.
Do you think that, so when I'm thinking of let's say a high school student or college or preparing kids for adulthood, I often sometimes think along the lines of being engaged in some type of activity. So maybe you like to do pickleball, maybe you like to rock climb, maybe you like to whatever. I think there's definitely those fitness components you need to hit, but then there should be some type of resistance training, maybe or maybe not. Sometimes I question. So should adults, and not being a bodybuilder, talking about just functional strength, being able to bend down and pick things up off the floor, maybe as we age, should all adults include maybe 2 days a week of full body resistance training in their workout routines or in their exercise regimen, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think all the guidance in the UK now is, we used to talk about moderate to vigorous exercise all the time and the cardiovascular benefits, but ever more so and increasingly so, we're talking about not just cardiovascular health but strength as well. So all the evidence is pointing that strength and CV is really, really important. So being able to pick up shopping bags and walk 100 metres, and those things are not just important for daily life and functioning, but also what you then do through physical activity as well. So it's about, if you go back to that human flourishing element, living optimally, there will be a point where, with a lack of strength or a lack of cardiovascular health, you are going to then start to have those hypokinetic diseases, things that are affected through sedentary behaviour and so on. So there's definitely living optimally, but I think there's also that extreme as well, like we mentioned. It's about making sure that we're using the science as well as what is meaningful. So it's not just about going to the gym and doing it because it's useful, but we also know that it's a meaningful experience and you're enjoying that movement. But strength, I would say, is as important as cardiovascular health, and that's what the science is saying.
Yeah. So what about, so I know there's a lot of movement towards, at least I know in maybe America, New York City, not sure, globally, but power.
Yeah.
So there's a big movement towards including the component of fitness of power, and the importance of that for human flourishing, or as people age, or the connection between longevity and quality of life, and power being a component of fitness that's kind of trained. And when I think power, I usually think run, jump, throw, kind of the basic 3. And when I'm thinking of a routine that would be, part of someone's daily exercise routine, because there's a strength component in there as well. Maybe even including some of those things in there as well.
Yeah, I would, going back to the monist and looking at it's all about making sure that it's varied. I think you should never really prioritise one over the other, but definitely components of fitness, yes, all have a role to play. And I kind of see what you're saying there in terms of if you never get out of first gear, you're not going to want to get out of first gear. So I definitely think that's important. I think it's about educating children, if we're talking about children too, around, I do this quite a lot when we go for our first run. I used to do this quite a lot anyway, was a lot of children hadn't been used to being out of breath, and so actually educating them around this is completely normal. Within a run, the first 3 to 4 minutes is really uncomfortable, but you'll settle, and explaining what's happening to the body. Same sort of thing, like if you've not sprinted for 100 metres, and you're not going to necessarily know what that feels like, but yeah, certainly putting the body through those paces, so not just staying at the sedentary, like at the lower levels, but really maximum effort too is really important. But again, anything working at maximal levels is going to have a safety implication as well. So we're really against things like the multi-stage fitness test or the bleeps test, because it's an adult test that's been incorporated into childhood, and physiologically it may not be appropriate for young children to be going through or performing at those maximum levels without due reason to, if that makes sense. So if they're an elite athlete, yeah, maybe, but...
At what age do you think that becomes appropriate?
So we tend to teach it when they go and choose like a GCSE in it, which is an examinable subject. So we often then teach it, but we administer the test. But a lot of those tests are used for athletes, and that's the biggest difference between this isn't extracurricular sport, this is physical education, which is about being prepared for life. Like, you may not need to do that. If you're in competitive sport, you will have that opportunity to multi-stage fitness test, but often when multi-stage fitness test is done in the curriculum, it's actually just a not very inclusive environment where those that are engaging in physical activity get rewarded because they're the last ones in, and those that actually probably need us the most are the first to go out and are humiliated. So it's about how do you use these things sensitively, because otherwise you're just reinforcing that this is that negative experience again, and you don't want to, this is not for you.
Yeah. I had a friend tell a classic pull-up story in high school. They couldn't do pull-ups, they're embarrassed. The teacher said, "Get on and do it anyway." Kind of to that point of, and once you're have a negative experience with it, especially as a kid, it gets very hard to, I guess, fix that or redesign their thought around movement.
Yeah.
But so, last little question here about, using fitness. When I think fitness also, oftentimes I'll use an activity to teach fitness. When you're doing your health and fitness unit, like for example, I might use pickleball to teach cardiovascular activity. Does your health and fitness unit look different? Does it look like a traditional fitness gym, kind of?
Yeah, well, two ways to do it exactly the same. You can either hide the health and fitness in an activity, which often means that physical activity levels are higher, or you can have a dedicated health and fitness lesson. So for example, it's not necessarily all about running, it could be all about yoga or Pilates or spinning, we're quite big on, and that normally goes up towards the latter end of school. So when they're getting into year 10 or 11 to 15, 16, and we're trying to replicate some of those things that they'll see in a leisure centre or in the community. But yeah, we have also done it where we use it in a different way. So for example, you might want to do a period of sustained running or continuous training, for example, but the emphasis is about resilience. So it's all about every time you get going again, is praising that, because you could have stopped and you could have walked, but you showed the resilience to keep going or to keep pushing yourself. So it's about understanding what you're teaching through it, not just doing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So, yeah, we're coming close to the end here. We're approaching the hour. But if people want to stay connected with IPLA, I know, like I said, I'm a member. How would people, what's the best way to stay connected with you or the association? And I know I want to give a big shout out to the books. I've read the first and parts of the second. I'm still working on it. But it was definitely life-changing for me. It made me totally rethink my physics curriculum. I absolutely love the book. But yeah, I guess like best ways to stay connected and
Yeah.
read more about your stuff.
Yeah, definitely. If you're interested in physical literacy, definitely read the 2 books by Margaret Whitehead, Physical Literacy Across the World, which is the 2017 one, or Physical Literacy Throughout the Life course, which is the 2010 book.
Which you wrote two chapters in
Yeah.
in the first one you mentioned.
Yeah, 2 chapters in the second one. Not any in the first one. That was all Margaret's then.
Yeah.
And then we've got a big handbook that's going to come out in 2025. So it's going to be from authors all over the world, which is going to be incredible read, hopefully. But yeah, the best place to go is to the website, which is www.physical-literacy.org.uk, or you could go to my kind of sister project that I'm involved with, which is PE Scholar, which is all about phys ed, so which is pescholar.com, and there's all of that there. And or I'm sure that you'll post a link to my Twitter handle, and people can reach out on Twitter. But yeah, I feel like we could have probably spoke for another 6 hours on what it all is.
I absolutely love, part of me doing the podcast was, I know people listening, but it was more for me. Like I said, I had a friend who, big shout out to Keith Dunbar, but he kind of kept saying like, come on man, when are you going to do the podcast? When are you going to do a podcast? And I would do some posts on Instagram, and I finally said, you know what, that'd be pretty cool, even just for myself. Like even if I had nobody listen. I mean, luckily I have some college students and this, that, and some influence in New York City physical education, but even if nobody listened, I said just to be able to sit and have conversations with like physical literacy, physical education, movement rock stars is just fun for me. So
But I guess my biggest tip though, because you can get a bit lost in the literature too, and you might get out of it thinking, where do I begin? Probably my biggest tip is that if you're a phys ed teacher, or even if you're a coach, on the way back in from your session, ask as many people on the way in, how was that session? But also just think about those 4 things: motivation, confidence, competence, and knowledge and understanding, and just rate yourself on how well you developed those children in that session or those people. And if you think, oh yeah, that was a really physically competent one, that's great, that's fine, but just think, oh, how could I motivate them more next time? Because without each of those, you're going to get barriers to participation. So without motivation, you're going to get apathy. Without confidence, anxiety. Without physical competence, frustration, why can't I receive that pitch or whatever it is. And then without knowledge and understanding, confusion. So you have to develop all 4 of those things if you want your influence to last a lifetime.
Yeah, and I think even as an adult, and I bring in some of the adult piece because I know I have a lot of friends who are interested in just, for their own thoughts around movement and embedding movement in their life. Even as an adult, I think thinking about those 4 things.
Yeah.
What is your motivation around what it is you choose, and how are you even developing your own confidence? And like when I think confidence, I think of small progressive steps. Oftentimes people jump into activities, they go full force, or they compare themselves to other people and say, oh, this person's so good. I remember the first time I did rock climbing, it's so sports specific. And I'm like, oh, I'm athletic, I'll jump on the wall, this will be no problem. And I'm like, how the heck is this guy so good at climbing? And then it could almost discourage you. I mean, luckily but to like be aware of that confidence piece and be aware of knowing where you are and taking small progressive steps, and being aware of what you're motivated to do. Kind of feel it when you're there, are you excited to be here? If not, there's other activities to, and you don't, there'll be obviously days you're not always excited and you still embark on it. But I think even as adults who are responsible for their own physical literacy journeys, just including that motivation and confidence, physical competence, because like I said, a lot of cardio kickboxers, they'll lose out on the technique. They'll just hit the bed, and then it's like, oh, why does my elbow hurt? Why does this hurt? Well, you actually, no matter, even if you're doing fitness, you still have to learn physical competence. You still have to learn how to move. Like, and the more you repeat something, if you're doing it wrong, you're definitely going to get hurt.
Yeah.
So, taking the time to learn the skill, and taking the time to hit all those pieces as well, I think even as adults is important too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. I quite like the. I often used to do different sports only because I like that learning curve.
Yeah.
And feeling that progression. So yeah, I definitely think that not being there because of other people and what other people think, but being the best version of yourself, and that could be being better than you were yesterday, or just going today. And every day is a new start, isn't it? So if you didn't go to the gym yesterday, that's fine, but today's a new opportunity, and tomorrow's a new opportunity. So yeah, don't get too hung up on what you haven't done, because you've always got opportunities in front of you.
Yeah.
It's never too late.
Not to hit you with one more quick one, but what do you do for your workout routine?
Oh,
Just
so I do.
curious.
So yeah, I go to netball on a Wednesday night, so that's my kind of competitive element. So on a netball Wednesday with the girls, and then mainly I go to the gym 3 to 4 times a week. But I've got a young family, so I've got a 2.5-year-old and a 4-year-old, 2 little boys. So they tend to keep me quite busy. So out and about as a family. So just trying, and a lot of people ask me that with young children. They say, well, everything you've read on physical literacy, what should I do? And and I know parenting is hard, and everyone's just trying to do their best. And all I say is just, I know it's important to move and for us to be active. So I just get us out of the house, and movement will come. So we'll try and go to the park, try and do something together every day that will be active.
My father did martial arts his whole life and raised me in martial arts. He said the family that kicks together sticks together. He used to take me and put me on his shoulders, and he'd do like the papas and things with me on there. There's definitely family activities and ways to engage together. There's tons of activities out there, and I think there's nothing better than a parent who leads by example. I mean, what a great way to set a foundation for physical literacy. I think part of me being who I am today and why I like to be so physically active is part of his borderline ADHD of sports. Of martial arts, snowboarding, handball, skateboarding. I mean, the list could go on and on. And I had a rich history of that, good positive experiences. So I think of kids as like wet concrete. As a parent, you have a wonderful opportunity to help mold and shape some of those things. And adults, we're a little more solid concrete. You could still do it with a chisel. You could still hack away. You could still change. The body will always be able to change, but it gets a little harder. So thinking about, even as a parent, how you invest in your child's journey of physical literacy is important too.
Yeah, definitely. Being that role model. And I think that when you have a child, it makes you reevaluate, what you want for them. Yeah. But you've also got to look after yourself, and you should also reflect and think, what do you want for yourself? Because if you can keep happy and healthy for as long as possible, then you're going to be in their lives a lot longer, and they're going to have you a lot longer. So yeah, definitely not just, we tend to look down, don't we, and provide a really enriching environment for them, but don't neglect yourself in that, because what they want is you 90% of the time.
Yeah. So, man, I really could keep going. My head's still spinning with 1,000 things I want to talk about, but I do want to respect time too. We're exactly at an hour, and I appreciate you. Yeah, I know you're here for the conference. I'm here for the conference. I got you at a lucky time, so I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me and be able to share some of your wisdom with New York City and whoever else is listening.
It's been an absolute pleasure. No, thank you for the invitation, and hopefully this is just the beginning of the conversation. And
for sure.
I'd be keen to hear what any thoughts of your students or anyone that's listening.
For sure.
Keep the conversation going.
For sure. Thank you.
No worries.